IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We've been covering the talks in Afghanistan on this podcast through 2020. These talks between the Taliban and the Americans and the Afghan government have been going on for quite a while, and it's very easy to lose touch of what's going on. Today's episode is an update on these talks. We're going to look at some new developments and what they mean for the region, for India. I'm joined, of course, by Mr. Arni and Pranay. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Aditya.
Thank you.
I want to start with you, Pranay. If you can just give us an update of what's happened, because most recently the Taliban and the Afghan government have begun direct talks in Doha. What does this mean?
Hi, Aditya. I think first things first, these talks between the US and Taliban have been going on like a soap opera more than anything else. A soap opera which has 1,000 episodes and very little change in what's happening. So I have lost interest and touch with it. So in any case, let me begin with what happened in Feb this year. So we done an episode in March where we discussed the agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban, and the United States of America. So this was the name of the agreement. And you can see the somersaults and the things that are being done in order to accommodate Taliban just by looking at the title of that article. Okay, so it goes at great lengths to mention how Taliban is not a state and yet the United States wants to negotiate with it. Anyways, the deal in that, the idea was that the Taliban needs to not attack US interests, not give shelter to Al-Qaeda. As long as they do that, the US agreed to a few conditions. It agreed to the fact that it will reduce its presence in Afghanistan. It said that US and all coalition will complete withdrawal of all remaining forces from Afghanistan within the remaining 9.5 months, and they will withdraw their forces from remaining bases. So this was sort of the broad agreement which was done. Basically, the US agreed that it will be reducing its presence in Afghanistan, and it will bring Taliban into the peace process, which indirectly means that Taliban will be in some form of governance role after that. Okay, so that was what happened in Feb. After that, the Taliban continued to attack Afghanistan forces. There were a lot of terrorist attacks in a bunch of cities. Those attacks have still gone unabated. But regardless, the US and Taliban peace talks, if you can call that so, have soldiered on. And then there was this idea of intra-Afghan talks. So the fact that there should be representation from the Afghanistan government and Taliban, and they should be made to talk. So that began after March. So it began in the last few months. And now the talks have proceeded in Doha, and further developments have taken place over that. So that's what has happened over the last few years. And what we are going to see now is that maybe there will be some sort of power sharing deal that is being worked out. Whether it will bring peace to Afghanistan or whether it is even going to work out, for that I think we should ask Mr. Arni.
Mr. Arni?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to whether it can bring peace to Afghanistan is something that I can't answer. And I'd like to start by saying that, yeah, I like the analogy of a soap opera. The only problem is nothing in Afghanistan goes to script. So you could have an evolving situation. Yeah, it's a soap opera. Episode number 1, season number 1, this is what happens. Season number 2, something else could happen. Now, the present situation, as far as Afghanistan goes, is that there were 20 points which it started with. Most of the 20 points were resolved. 18 of them were resolved, 2 were left over. That is the Hanafi Jafri this thing issue. And the second one was, of course, the US using the US Taliban agreement as the base document rather than looking at something else like the interests of the Afghan people. It seemed to have been deadlocked around the middle of October, as a consequence of which the Taliban, the ISI chief flew down to Doha to prod both sides and to prod at least one side of it. And this was simultaneously, at the same time, you had Abdullah flying across to Pakistan, then India, and then he went to Iran. He was in Iran till a couple of days ago. We don't really know what was the rationale, what was the background to these visits. I can only speculate that he was positioning himself as a potential head of the interim arrangement, which is what the Taliban is hoping to move towards, and which I suspect the Afghans are also prepared to go under certain conditions, leaving aside the fact that the Ashraf Ghani may have different views on this. Now, Abdullah's visit to Delhi, to Pakistan, and his talks with the Americans seem to have raised some level of concern within Ashraf, within the ruling, within the present Afghan dispensation, so much so that the president and his first vice president, Amrullah Saleh, both flew down to Qatar. They did not meet the Taliban, but they talked to the Amir of Doha, of Qatar, and also spoke to the Americans there. I think they seemed to be concerned that they are moving in the direction that they, to articulate what their positions on an interim arrangement could be. I don't think that at the present moment the conditions are such that I stepped down. That was middle of September, middle of October. Latest position as of yesterday is that Khalilzad is coming back to the region, or has already come back. En route, he stopped at Norway to talk to the Norwegians, and then would be coming here. A couple of tweets he put out showed a lot of concern about the high levels of violence. He didn't refer to Helmand, but he did say that there were external forces at play, and the external forces could probably either suggest Pakistan or Iran, more likely Iran, because there was some initial suspicion that the operations in Helmand were by a group of the Taliban, which were aligned or closer to Iran than to anybody else. Now, this brings the situation to a point where it clearly shows that the Taliban does not entirely control its forces on the ground. The people that the Americans have been talking to are essentially a group of the Taliban dominated by the Haqqani network, and it's not all-encompassing. That sort of an all-encompassing Taliban will only come up under different circumstances. This is an American-driven dialogue with, what can I say? I mean, I would like Pranay used the word soap opera. I'd like to define this as an American-driven, Pakistan-driven, American-facilitated dialogue. There's nothing more than that. I don't think it reflects the views of all of Afghanistan.
Mr. Arni, the fear initially was that this intra-Afghan talks might not even begin in the first place, but I guess that hurdle seems to have been crossed somehow. So how do you think this intra-Afghan talks have actually been going? Like, in the sense that are there any agreements likely to be reached between the two parties or not?
There are a couple of pluses that you can pull out of this whole situation. One is that you have a platform where the two sides are talking to each other. They may not recognize each other, but they've begun talking to each other. You have a venue, you have everything, all the ingredients are there. Both sides have nominated a group of facilitators, 3 on each side. There's one woman, Fatima Gailani, who can be expected to take a position, pro-woman position. So I'm not sure if that's really, that seems to be a suitable arrangement from the Afghan side. And you have Qatar now acting not as a moderator, not like or a mediator, but as a facilitator, which means that the dialogue is going to be ongoing in some form or the other. And if Norway comes in, Norway has had a history of being into conflict resolution. If the Americans are trying to bring in Norway, it means that this will probably be, you will see a lot of Norwegian, like the Norwegians did in Sri Lanka, flying across here, in various places and trying to mediate. That sort of a role could be there. For the moment, let me say that I don't see anything happening till the US elections are over. And the US elections would mark a point, because whatever the decision, whatever happens, whether it's Trump or Biden, Zalmay Khalilzad's position in the dialogue will probably lessen. If it's a return to Trump again, you'd probably find his position lessening, and then it will probably go into a different orbit. If it is Biden, of course, you could find a whole new texture to it. It's not that the peace talks are going to be jettisoned if Biden comes to position. This Congress and Senate in the US has a maximum number of veterans, and there is a feeling that this is an unwinnable war, but it's just that there is need to have a dialogue, but how the two sides have a different view. The end aim is, of course, to go in the direction of a Bond 2, or that's a sense I have. Bond 1 saw a dialogue between excluded the Taliban, and had a dialogue between the Northern Alliance on one hand and the Royalists on the other hand. Royalists meaning the King's people, who are supposed to represent the South, the Pashtun South. The Northern Alliance represented all those forces. Well, it's not really, you couldn't say ethnic and minorities, because you also had to admit that there were some forces amongst the Taliban, amongst the Pashtuns who were with the Northern Alliance. So it was more of the alliance that fought the Taliban. That led to a power sharing arrangement, which we saw as an interim arrangement, which each side having 13 or 30, something of that nature, 13 ministers under an interim president who was Karzai. That is what the Taliban seem to be driving for. There are a couple of touch points on how far they would go, or what is their base position, but that we could come at the subsequent point. Yeah.
But Mr. Arni, the Bonn Agreement of 2001 was the product of heavy international intervention. Can the Afghan government and the Taliban come up with a complex deal like this by themselves without very active facilitation? And is Norway up to that task?
It's not only Norway. It's going to be Germany. There have been offers of facilitation by the Germans. Facilitation, at least giving them space to talk. The Russians are also involved. There will be international consensus on having a bomb too, provided how do I describe it? Provided that the non-Taliban Pashtun are also represented in some fashion. So it's not going to be entirely, it's not going to be exactly what the Taliban want, to replace the royalists and talk to the northerners. It's going to be, Taliban will be one of the constituents, maybe one of the larger constituents, but there will probably be two or three parties at this dialogue.
Right. Related to that, Mr. Arni, like you mentioned, the most important variable in all this is the US administration and what shapes up. So, for example, the National Security Advisor in the beginning of October had mentioned that US will be reducing its troops to 2,600 by Feb next year or something like that. So, you think all those are just statements at this moment, and they'll probably take place depending on what happens in the elections?
Yes, I would think it will take place in the elections. They've already got some escape routes. The Taliban were supposed to reduce levels of violence. That hasn't taken place. Though they may not have targeted US forces, there have been a number of incidents. In fact, larger number of incidents today now than before. In the recent past, you've had over 200 dead and 400 injured. That's just in a couple of weeks. That sort of levels is very, very high.
So, Mr. Arni, is there any way that the Taliban can live with a small number of American troops in Afghanistan, or is that simply out of the question?
I think that's already inherent there in the agreement. It will come down to about 4,000 or 4,500. Of course, the Taliban would like an eventual withdrawal of the US forces, but you must remember that if the Americans pull out entirely, they're quite capable of losing interest and focus on Afghanistan and leave it in a sort of a situation which could evolve which could move in the direction of a civil war. That's something that the Taliban would not want, because it's not. You need international attention, or you need international involvement, largely because you need money to run the Afghan government. And the Taliban on its own cannot raise this money. In fact, it'll all dry up if they came to power. They're aware of that.
So, Mr. Arni, I want to come to the other regional players here, starting with Pakistan. What has Pakistan been doing? Is it just been dealing with the Taliban directly, or is it up to something else?
As of the moment, as the talks were progressing, one felt that a lot of the cards were in their hands, largely because it was the Haqqani network who were driving the whole show. That's at Doha. And even operations within Afghanistan were attributed either to ISIS or international terrorists or nameless groups. But we pretty well know that these type of operations in heart of Kabul could not have taken place without some sort of Haqqani network involvement or the Taliban involvement.
Right.
The ISIS is not made up of very many Taliban or Afghans. The ISK, let's say, not made up of very many Afghans. It is predominantly foreigners there. And or even if there are Afghans, they're not Kabul variety. They're not people who are very, very familiar with Kabul. And the degree of sophistication in some of these operations in Kabul was a different sort. It wasn't really that which the ISK was known for. What has happened is that the ISK, till about 2 months ago, had its leader was a gentleman called Maulvi Faruqi, who is an LET, who's a Pathan, but was with LET. It's one of the few people who are non-Punjabi origin with the LET. And he had apparently been to Syria and got some battle experience there and taken some cadres there, and he's come back and came back and the Taliban, the ISI forced him onto the leadership of the ISK. That was done in exchange for sanctuaries in Pakistan, etc., whatever. But the ISK came under Pakistani influence. Now, about 2 months ago, Maulvi Faruqi was arrested by the NDS, and he's in Afghan custody. But that's the thing. So what Pakistan did was, to have an inside edge in the talks in Doha, but to keep the levels of violence at a higher level than before, so that it convinced the Americans to keep after the Kabul government to go in for the talks. To sort of bring pressure on the Americans. What seems to have taken them by surprise is the Helmand operation, which was probably a very, very, I don't have very sketchy information, but from various accounts, it seems to be driven by by a pro-Iran faction, which clearly suggests that the Taliban in Doha is not entirely in control of what's happening. The cards are with the ISI for the moment. We have to see. I think even they are probably waiting till after the elections to see how it goes. The elections would have also a little after the FATF ruling. All that seems to have been factors in keeping the Pakistanis, making the Pakistanis wait till after the elections.
I think one more point here, Mr. Arni, is that the role of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is also interesting in the sense that first he came back and said that he wanted to become a part of the Afghanistan government, and then he was trying to contest the elections as well, and now he's gone and switched back sides, gone to Islamabad again. So what is the reason for this somersaults?
He's a perennial prime minister in waiting. I think he was prime minister on 2 occasions, but neither of which he could even step foot in Afghanistan or in Kabul. I'm not saying he's a spent force now, but his relevance is decreasing unless the Pakistanis prop him up. And he's trying to win favor there. I'm sure the Pakistanis would be reasonably comfortable with him. He was their preferred choice if there is an interim leadership. But on his own, he doesn't have much of a following. Even his party in Afghanistan is also split. The political wing has split from him. You must remember that in the old days, there were only 2 groups that an Afghan could aspire to, either the Hizb-e-Islami of Hekmatyar or the communists. And those who didn't want to be communists but wanted to play a role joined forces with Hekmatyar. So there was no third option. And he was the one who was looked at as pro-West, etc., was moderately educated. So they went with him. That group is now disillusioned and has moved away from him. Probably, they say he commands about 400-500 people, militants. That also is questionable. These things are ephemeral, he may have 400-500 now, but tomorrow if the situation changes, you could have Hekmatyar coming back as a leader of a large group. We don't know. It's not. He doesn't have acceptability outside of Afghanistan, or let me say outside of Pakistan. But he's there. He's a force. He's a factor.
Mr. Arni, you also mentioned Iran and its influence on the Afghanistan. How is Iran approaching these talks? What are its measures?
I'm not sure they're acting as spoilers, but definitely want to show that they are a force in Afghanistan. They have interests in Afghanistan. There are Hazaras Shias who are Shias, and Iran feels some sort of a residual obligation in a sense, to look after them. You must, if you go back to 1998, I think it was 1998, when you had the Taliban slaughter thousands of Shia Hazaras in Mazar-e-Sharif and in that area. It was sort of an ethnic cleansing. Those concerns are there. You have had Iranian diplomats being assassinated by the Taliban, a situation that led to a near war when they massed 80,000 troops and just stopped short of invading Afghanistan. Those are they have genuine reasons to be interested, genuine factors which propel them. If you're asking me what are the cards that they hold, I would draw attention to what is that force which was fought in Iraq. I've forgotten the name, Fatimiyun Battalion, which was estimated to have anything between 5,000 to 10,000 Afghan Shias fighting alongside fighting in Syria. So they are battle hardened. They're trained people who are paid and reasonably well trained. They're back now in Afghanistan. So you have this force there, which is nobody really factors into any, in the event of something happening, this force will be a very potent force.
All right, Mr. Arni, we've looked at Pakistan, Iran, and also Russia. What does all of this mean finally for India itself?
I'm very skeptical, Aditya, whether a Taliban presence in Kabul or a power sharing arrangement will give us any room for solace. We've always had problems with the training of terrorists on Afghan soil. And I gather, or at least there are some glimmerings which indicate that the Taliban has not been able to arrive at any understanding as yet with the. I mean, there's some sort of 27-point this thing which has been given to the Al Qaeda by the Taliban, and I'm not sure that they've arrived at any understanding with the Al Qaeda or any of the other groups. Yeah, the focus of the Taliban would really be to ensure that there are no attacks on U.S. property or U.S. U.S. bases, or even any planning for attacks on U.S. targets. But that doesn't. What about India? It leaves us out in the cold. Even if there is a sort of an enforcement regime, which I don't think is possible, you must remember that there will be factions within the Taliban who could undertake to provide training. Most of the training in the earliest lot, in the late 90s, was in training camps in the Loya Paktika region, which is the home ground of the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network is hand in glove with the ISI, so in their territories you can expect some sort of sanctuary being provided for our bad eggs. There are two other related issues of which we should be a little concerned. I was just talking about training of our bad eggs. You could also remember that in earlier circumstances, the terrorists in Pakistan were pushed across. Pakistan rid itself of its terrorists by pushing them across, jihadi terrorists by pushing them across the border to Afghanistan. That's really what happened in Waziristan. That sort of a thing could happen even now. And if you have the FATF coming into play, and Pakistan could very well push even the Lashkar cadres and the Jaish cadres across the border into sanctuaries in Afghanistan, and then say, "Hey, go look, we are clean. We have got nothing on our soil." So they've all fled from here. From there they could plot and scheme and do whatever they want to when it comes to global targets. Then we have a third thing. We have to be severe. We have to be conscious of the Taliban and their own narrow view of the world. Their view of the world is, bereft of any logic. Their attitude towards women is something that will not go down well in India. There would be some sort of pressure building up in India if we see something happening in our neighborhood, particularly in a SAARC country. Then we have also, no matter how much the Taliban can talk about arriving at solving the Hanafi Jafri issue and coming up with a solution, that's not going to work, because the Taliban has always held that the Shia is a kafir. There have been pogroms against the Shias. The Hazara Shias have been specifically targeted in 1998, and you could have more of this, and all this will will have an effect on our perception, our own attitudes within the country. These are issues that we are conscious about, religious and sectarian issues, and I think we have to be a little more than a little cautious about accepting a Taliban thing. And the bottom line is really, it's not so much. We have always been holding that it should be an Afghan-driven, Afghan-owned, Afghan-led process. I think you've got to substitute US-led, Pakistan-owned, and Taliban-controlled, or whatever, in place of in this sort of thing. It is not Afghan. No matter how much you add to all this, it's still not an Afghan-led or Afghan-controlled process. The Afghans have been led into this process, arm twisted to come into this process, and it's a process which is controlled in Islamabad. So that we have to be very conscious about, and that's something that is not in our best interests. That's from, I think, of course, you must remember that we invested 3 billion of aid, 3 billion of our money in that country. I don't think we we have that. I think that's going to be another issue that's going to be causing us some concern. What happens to our investments? What happens to all this goodwill that we try to generate?
Okay. So if I were to summarize that, you'd say that some Indian insurgent groups could move to parts of Afghanistan to train. To Pakistan themselves could, in a sense, offshore some of their own insurgent groups for some degree of deniability. 3, just the very character of the Taliban makes it a problem for India. And 4, of course, our sunk costs, our investments in that country are at risk. And I mean, we don't know what we'll get for it. The only thing I would ask here, Mr. Arni, is since the Taliban may not be able to enforce a full hegemony over a land as sprawling and big and diverse as Afghanistan, are there factions or people in that country that we should continue to strengthen even after such an agreement is done?
We have friends in the north. We have friends all over Afghanistan. Leave aside the Taliban, I think every other group have been traditionally close to us. And we have to keep fostering this. I don't want to go into specifics of whom we should foster. That's something that the government of India is better placed to work at. And you've seen a stream of people coming in the last couple of weeks. You had Dostam coming in and appealing for Indian aid, and really not appealing as much as coming in and meeting our foreign minister. You had Mahmoud Atta from Mazar-e-Sharif, the Tajik leader. He's the head of the he's head of the Jamaat-e-Islami, coming in, and the governor of Mazar coming in and also meeting our external affairs minister. So that's two powerful leaders, leaders of two groups which have already come in. Dostam represents the Turkmen and the Uzbek minorities. That's about 10% of Afghanistan. You have the Atta who's come in, who represents the bulk of the 27%, who's a very important leader of the 27% strong Tajik group. So you've got well over 35%, representatives well over 35% coming into India. So I suspect that this is all, they would probably be ringing alarm bells in India and telling us to be cautious, telling us about their own concerns and fears. So that's the rest of it. Of course, the government of India, I'm sure, would do something on this.
All right. This is an evolving situation, and it's really hard for most of the rest of us to keep track of it. So thank you, Mr. Arni, for explaining a lot of this to us. And we'll keep tracking what's going on in Afghanistan here on All Things Policy. So thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for more episodes on this very subject.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Taksashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I also just want to ask everybody if they could go to the website ivmpodcast.com/survey and fill out a quick survey for us. It would be much appreciated. What a week we had this week. We had so much crossover, so many great guests. I don't even know where to start. Okay, yeah, I do know where to start. Let's start with Uncle Please Sit. Uncle Please Sit, Joel and Tushar had Hamsini Hariharan. Hamsini hosts a show called States of Anarchy with their network. She is a China expert, and they discussed the India-China relationship. Really fascinating conversation. Cyrus had 2 conversations this week instead of our normal Thursday Cock and Bull. Great conversations, both of them. We'll be back with our regular Cock and Bull next week. But this week, you could definitely check out the conversation he had with Varun Grover. Really fascinating stuff. And Nikhil Taneja, who was the founder of Yuva and the creative director for the India Film Project Festival, which is going on this weekend. He was on the show as well. Cyrus was also on Advertising is Dead this weekend with Varun Dugirala. Cyrus and Varun discussed Cyrus's intent on randomness. Ranveer Brar, guested on Gauri Devi Dayal show. This round's on me. Another amazing conversation over there. Priyanka Khimani, one of the best IP lawyers in this country, was on Storytellers and Storysellers for a fascinating conversation. Definitely do check that out. And finally, I wanted to congratulate Zarina Poonawala for her 100th episode. She had Ashish Vidyarthi as a guest on that. If you have not been listening to the Empowering series, please do. It's one of the great shows out there. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday. सिर्फ IVM podcast app या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.